The petition was still warm from the printer when the process server handed it to me on my own porch, and I remember thinking that was strange, that paper could hold heat like that, like it had just come out of something violent. I read the first page standing up, coffee going cold on the railing behind me. Emergency motion for temporary custody. My name typed out in full, Reese Calloway Holt, like the court needed to be sure it had the right woman. Then a paragraph that made my stomach drop straight through the porch boards. Respondent has a documented history of post-traumatic stress and exhibits patterns consistent with emotional instability that pose a risk to the minor children. They had my therapy records, not summarized, not paraphrased, quoted, with a session date I recognized immediately because it was the week after the anniversary of a day I don't talk about. A day that belongs to a man named Curtis Boyd, who isn't here anymore because of a supply convoy rollover that happened on my watch. Not in a firefight, not in some movie moment, just bad road and worse timing. I set the papers down on the porch rail very carefully, the way you learn to set down anything that might go off if you drop it. Inside, I could hear Jack narrating a battle between two dinosaurs at the kitchen table, and Mia correcting his pronunciation of Tyrannosaurus without looking up from her cereal. Normal sounds. A normal Tuesday. I stood on that porch for exactly as long as it took to remember that panic was a choice I hadn't made yet, and I still had time not to make it. I did not walk into that kitchen shaking. 14 years of logistics work teaches you that the worst thing you can do when a shipment goes wrong is let the people around you see your hands move too fast. I folded the petition once, put it in my bag, and made pancakes. It would be several weeks before I understood that Derek and his mother hadn't found those records by accident, and that the therapy notes were never the real danger at all. The real danger was something neither of them had bothered to explain to me, something that had nothing to do with a diagnosis, and everything to do with what people do when they're more afraid of losing money than of losing each other. But that morning, all I knew was that the man I'd been married to for 12 years had let a lawyer write the word unstable next to my name, and somewhere in that house, he was probably still asleep. A few weeks earlier, none of this had a shape yet. It was just a Thursday, and Derek was standing at the kitchen island, scrolling through something on his phone with the particular stillness he got when a number he didn't like was staring back at him.
"You ever think about what happens if Meridian drops your contract?" he asked, not looking up.
I was rinsing Jack's lunchbox. "They're not dropping it. We just renewed." "I'm just saying, consulting work isn't exactly stable income." I'd heard some version of this sentence for months by then. Derek had never been able to describe what I actually did for Meridian Defense Solutions beyond logistics stuff, which was fair because I hadn't gone out of my way to explain it, and because half of what I advised on wasn't his to know anyway. 14 years in the Army teaches you where the line is between privacy and secrecy, and I'd never once crossed it. I just hadn't realized how much room that left for someone to fill in the blanks with whatever story suited them.
"It's a retainer contract, Derek. It's more stable than construction."
That landed exactly the way I knew it would. Holt & Sons had been his father's company, then his, and lately it had been more his mother's than either of theirs, the way she still locked into the office every morning like she owned the place, because technically, on paper, 22% of it she did. "I'm not talking about construction," he said, too fast. "I'm talking about our accounts, what we actually have." "We have what we have. Why does it matter right now?" He didn't answer that. He picked up his coffee and said something about a meeting with the bank on Friday, and when I asked which bank, he said Sandhills Regional, like it was obvious, like I was supposed to already know, and then he changed the subject to whether Jack needed new cleats. I let it go. That was my mistake, if I'm honest about it. Not the not knowing, but the letting go. I had spent a career trained to flag anomalies, to notice when a manifest didn't match a shipment, and I looked at my own husband hiding something behind a question about our children's savings account, and I told myself it was stress. I told myself it wasn't my business to push. On the fridge that week was a flyer for Mia's school fundraiser, a laminated thermometer chart tracking how close her class was to their goal for new library books. I remember looking at it while Derek talked about the bank meeting, thinking about how much easier it was to track a number when somebody wrote it on a poster for everyone to see. It gave me an idea I wouldn't act on for 2 more weeks. That if a number could be tracked openly like that, on a wall for anyone to check, then a number could also be hidden quietly in an account nobody was showing me. Vivian came by that same week, ostensibly to take the kids for ice cream, though she ended up staying long enough to fold a load of laundry she hadn't been asked to fold, and to mention twice how tired I looked. "You've got circles under your eyes, baby," she said, the dish towel over her shoulder like a stole. "You sleeping all right?" "I'm fine, Vivian. I ran into Carol Ann Pruitt at church. Her daughter works the front desk over at Dr. Reyes's office." She said this with the particular brightness of a woman delivering information she wants you to know she has. "She said you've been keeping up your appointments. That's good. That's real good, staying consistent with something like that." I stood very still at the sink. I didn't realize my appointments were something people discussed at church. "Nobody's discussing anything, sweetheart. Carol Ann just mentioned it in passing. I think it's wonderful you take care of yourself." She smiled the smile she used when she wanted a conversation to be over before it had properly started. Family just worries, is all. I told myself that was a small town being a small town. Sandhills was the kind of place where everybody's business moved through 3 or 4 mouths before it got back to you, shaped like posip instead of fact. And I'd lived there long enough to know Vivian collected small facts about people, the way other women collected recipes. I didn't think, not yet, that she was building a file. She left with a tin of banana bread on the counter and a comment about how a woman who's been through what you've been through deserves peace. And it wasn't until much later that I understood she hadn't been talking about my peace at all. The night everything actually changed, I came home 2 hours early because a video call with a program manager in Huntsville had gotten pushed to the following week. One of those small administrative accidents that turns out to matter more than anything you planned on purpose. I pulled into the driveway behind Derek's truck instead of my usual spot by the garage, and I noticed the kitchen light was on, and his voice was carrying through the screen door, low, but not low enough. I didn't walk in. I don't know exactly why. Some old instinct, maybe. The same one that used to make me pause at a checkpoint, even when everything looked routine. If the therapy notes go in without context, it's not even a fight, Mom. The judge sees PTSD and unstable in the same paragraph, and that's the whole case. No, I know Dr. Reyes won't hand them over voluntarily. That's what the subpoena's for. Another voice, tinnier, coming through speakerphone. "Vivian?" "You let Patrick handle the wording. The point isn't proving anything, Derek. The point is planting the idea before she even knows there's a fight. And once the paperwork's moving on the custody side, nobody's going to be looking too close at the LLC." I stood on my own porch with my keys still in my hand and felt something in my chest go very quiet and very cold at the same time, the way it does right before you stop feeling and start functioning. "What LLC?" Derek said, and there was something in his voice I hadn't expected. Confusion. Genuine confusion. "Don't worry about the LLC," Vivian said. "You worry about Friday. I'll handle the rest." He said something else, something about not wanting it to get ugly, and she told him ugly was better than losing everything his father built. And then the call ended, and I heard him set his phone down hard on the counter. I stood there long enough to make sure my breathing was even. Then I walked back to my car, backed quietly out of the driveway, and drove 3 blocks to the church parking lot before I let myself pull over and just sit there, hands on the wheel, doing the thing I'd trained myself to do, in worse places than a Honda Pilot in North Carolina. I made a list. Not of feelings, of facts. Fact, they had my therapy records, or were getting them. Fact, this had been planned enough to have a lawyer's name attached to it, Patrick. Fact, there was an LLC that Derek apparently didn't even fully understand. Fact, I had roughly no time before whatever Friday meeting he'd mentioned turned into something I couldn't undo. I did not go back inside and confront him that night. I have turned that decision over more times than I can count since then, and I still think it was the right one. It still cost me something to make it. I drove 3 blocks with my hands too steady on the wheel, the kind of steady that isn't calm so much as refusal, and some younger version of me rode along the whole way, insisting that a wife who really loved her husband would have just walked back in and said his name. Instead, at 11 at night, sitting in a dark church parking lot with my kids' booster seats empty in the back, I called a number I'd saved 8 months earlier after a conversation with another Army spouse at Jack's school pickup line,
a woman who'd needed a family law attorney for entirely different reasons, and had passed along a name like a small mercy she didn't know she was giving me. Dana Okafor picked up on the fourth ring, which told me she wasn't the kind of person who let a phone ring out.
This is going to sound strange, I said, but I need to talk to someone about custody law, and I need it to be tonight, or as close to tonight as you can manage. It's 11 o'clock, she said, not unkindly. Tell me the strange part first.
So I did. All of it. The petition I didn't have yet, but could feel coming. The therapy notes, the LLC neither of us understood. The word subpoena said out loud by a woman who baked me banana bread. Dana was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed register, gone flat and precise in a way I recognized, because it was the same tone I used when a shipment manifest didn't add up, and I needed everyone in the room to stop talking and start listening.
Okay, she said, here's what we're not going to do. We're not going to wait for them to file and then react. If they're planning to weaponize a diagnosis, we get ahead of the story, not behind it. Starting tomorrow, I want you writing down every conversation, every date, everything Vivian says to you that sounds like it's testing the waters. And I want the name of your therapist, because if there's a subpoena coming for those records, I'd rather Dr. Reyes hear it from us, with context, than get blindsided by opposing counsel.
They're going to say I'm unstable, I said, and it came out steadier than I expected, because of PTSD, because of Curtis.
They're going to try, Dana said. Whether it works depends entirely on what we put in front of the judge before they get the chance to define you first.
I sat in that parking lot a long time after we hung up. I didn't cry, not that night. I thought about a lot of things. About Curtis Boyd's mother, who still sent me a Christmas card every year with a photograph of a grandson he never got to meet. About the DD-214 folded in a fireproof box in my closet that Derek had probably looked at exactly once, the day we got engaged, and never again. About the fact that somewhere in the last 3 weeks, without my noticing the exact moment it happened, I had stopped being a wife who trusted her husband's family and become a woman building a case. I drove home a little after midnight. The kitchen light was off. Derek was asleep, or pretending to be, and I lay next to him in the dark with my eyes open, running numbers I didn't have yet, thinking about a phrase Vivian had used on the phone that kept snagging on something in my memory. Nobody's going to be looking too close at the LLC. I didn't know yet what that meant, but I knew the way you know when a load is riding wrong on a truck before you can say exactly why, that it was going to matter more than anything written in my medical file. I started pulling bank statements the following week, after the kids were down and Derek had gone to bed early, worn thin from long days at job sites that were starting to feel more like triage than construction. I told myself I was just being thorough for Dana. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I was looking the way I'd been trained to look, for the thing that doesn't match the pattern around it. It took me until almost midnight to find it. A transfer, $12,000 out of the joint household account and into something called Ridgeline Holdings LLC, dated 4 days after the Thursday I'd stood at the sink rinsing Jack's lunchbox and told myself Derek's questions about our accounts weren't worth pushing on. 4 days. I sat with that number for a long time. If I'd pushed that night instead of talking about cleats, I don't know if it would have stopped anything. I've never been able to make myself believe it wouldn't have. Then another transfer, smaller, 4 months earlier. Then a third, older still. 3 transfers over the better part of a year, each one authorized with Derek's signature, though the one dated 4 days after that Thursday was the one I kept coming back to, the one that was, at least partly, mine to have stopped. Something about the handwriting on the digital authorization form looked stiffer than his usual scrawl, more careful, like someone copying a signature rather than making one. I sat at that kitchen table with the laptop screen the only light in the house, and for a long moment I didn't feel angry. I felt the specific, focused calm that used to come over me at 3 a.m. when a manifest didn't reconcile, and somewhere out there was a truck that had left with the wrong cargo. Somebody, somewhere, had moved money out of my children's world and put a name on it that neither Derek nor I had ever discussed. I photographed every statement. I emailed them to myself and to Dana with a subject line that just said Ridgeline before I let myself go to bed. And even then, I lay awake, doing what I'd always done best, breaking a problem into pieces small enough to move. The emergency petition arrived 9 days later, exactly the way it had in the version of that morning I would eventually come to think of as the one where everything caught up to itself. The process server on the porch, the coffee going cold, Jack narrating dinosaurs at the table while I read a sentence with my own name in it, and the word instability sitting next to 14 years of service, like it belonged there. The filing was precise in a way that told me it had been drafted long before it had ever printed. It cited a specific therapy session, quoted 2 lines from a records request that shouldn't have existed yet, and asked for immediate temporary custody pending a full hearing, on the grounds that the children's safety could not wait. Dana read it over the phone with me 20 minutes later, her voice level. "This is aggressive," she said, "and it's sloppy in one specific way that's going to help us. They quoted session content they can't have had legal access to yet. That's not evidence. That's a leak. And leaks have sources." "Vivian," I said. "Probably. We'll get there. Right now we respond, and we respond fast, because there's an emergency hearing coming, and emergency hearings favor whoever looks calmer in the room." The emergency hearing came 10 days after that, in a courtroom too small for the weight of what was happening inside it. Folding chairs along one wall, a window unit rattling in the corner, because the building's real air conditioning had been down since June. Derek sat with his attorney, a compact, confident man named Patrick Ambrose, who had the look of someone who won more cases by talking fast than by being right. Vivian sat 1 row back, in a cream blazer, hands folded, watching the proceedings with the stillness of a woman who already knew how this part would go. The judge, a soft-spoken woman named Judge Alvarez, moved through the record quickly. She had a full docket, and this was, on paper, a preliminary matter, not the main event. Patrick argued that pending full discovery, the court should grant temporary primary custody to Derek to protect the children's stability while the underlying mental health concerns are properly evaluated. Dana argued that no clinical evaluation had actually been conducted, that the petition rested entirely on selectively quoted records obtained through improper means, and that removing children from a stable home based on unverified allegations would itself be destabilizing. Judge Alvarez split the difference, the way emergency hearings so often do. Temporary shared custody, weighted slightly toward Derek's household on school nights, pending a full evidentiary hearing in 3 weeks. Not a loss, not a win either. A pause, with Derek's name written a little larger on it. Outside the courthouse, Vivian caught my eye across the parking lot. She didn't smile, exactly. It was something quieter than a smile, the look of a woman confirming to herself that a plan was still on schedule. "This didn't have to happen this way," she said, close enough that only I could hear it. "You could have just been honest with him about how much you're really carrying. Instead, we're all standing out here in the heat." She paused, straightening a cuff that didn't need straightening. 3 weeks isn't very long, you know. I'd use it wisely if I were you." I didn't answer her, but I noticed it, the way she'd said 3 weeks, like she already knew exactly what was going to happen inside them, the way you know the outcome of a meeting you've already had. I got in my car, and I did not let my hands shake on the wheel until I was 3 streets away, out of sight of the building. And even then, it wasn't fear. It was fury, tightly held, with nowhere yet to go. That night, Mia asked why she wasn't sleeping at our house on Thursdays anymore, and I told her the truth, in the smallest, safest version I had, that grown-ups were sorting out a disagreement, and that it had nothing to do with anything she'd done, and that I would always, always tell her when something changed. She accepted this the way children do, provisionally, watching my face for the tell that would say I was lying. I don't think she found one. I'd had a lot of practice keeping my face steady in rooms that mattered more than that one. 2 weeks before the full hearing, I sat across from Dana in her office, a converted duplex 2 blocks off Main Street, with a window unit that worked better than the courthouse's. She'd lay out a legal pad with 2 columns. "We've got 2 fights here, not one," she said. "Fight 1 is the custody allegation. We need Dr. Reyes on record, in context, and we need a character witness who can speak to your fitness and stability without it sounding rehearsed. Fight 2 is Ridgeline Holdings, and I want to be honest with you. I don't yet know what Fight 2 is worth. It might be nothing. It might be everything. But if we open that door with a subpoena, we don't get to control what walks through it." "Open it," I said. She studied me for a second. "You understand that includes your own finances, your Meridian contract, your income, everything. If we're asking the court to look hard at money, they look hard at all of it.
I've got nothing to hide in mine, I said. I can't say the same about theirs. She nodded and started drafting the request that afternoon. Financial discovery covering both households, plus a subpoena to Sandhills Regional Bank for records related to Ridgeline Holdings LLC. Patrick objected within 48 hours, calling it a fishing expedition, an attempt to distract from the real question of the children's welfare. Judge Alvarez granted it anyway, narrowly, giving both sides 2 weeks to comply before the full hearing. What struck Dana when the subpoena went out was how fast Sandhills Regional Bank moved to comply. Faster, she said, than any bank she dealt with in 11 years of family law practice. The kind of speed that usually meant a compliance department that had already flagged an account internally and was relieved someone else had finally asked. Banks don't rush unless they're covering themselves, she told me over the phone. Something about that account was already making somebody nervous before we ever got involved. I remember the particular quality of that waiting. It wasn't like waiting for a deployment order, where at least you knew a date was coming. It was more like waiting for weather. You could feel the pressure building, but you couldn't see the storm yet, only the color the sky was turning. Dr. Naomi Reyes agreed to meet with Dana and me the following week, not to discuss the content of my sessions, which she made clear she would not do without proper legal process, but to talk about what the record request itself had asked for. They wanted everything, she said, sliding a copy of the subpoena across her desk, the version that had been sent directly to her office before the court-approved one ever existed. Full session notes, no date restriction, no clinical framing required. That's not how a legitimate custody evaluation works. A custody evaluation looks at present functioning. This wanted a decade of raw material to select from. Can you speak to that in court? Dana asked. I can speak to the standard of care, Dr. Reyes said. I can speak to the fact that ongoing treatment for combat-adjacent trauma is not, in itself, evidence of parental unfitness. Quite the opposite in most clinical literature. Consistent engagement with treatment is a positive indicator. What I won't do is hand over content without the proper protective order in place, and I'll say that to the judge as plainly as I'm saying it to you. I sat there and felt something in my chest loosen slightly for the first time in weeks. Not relief, exactly. More like watching one load-bearing wall get checked and confirmed solid before you keep building. Vivian had been so certain the records alone would be enough. I was starting to understand that certainty had made her sloppy, and that sloppiness, in this business, was the first crack in any wall. The bank records came back 6 days before the hearing, a thick manila envelope Dana set on the desk between us, like it might be heavier than it looked. I want to be honest about that night, because it's the one I keep coming back to, even now. It wasn't dramatic in the way people probably expect. There was no scream, no dropped coffee cup, no sudden physical collapse. I sat at Dana's desk with the overhead light humming and read through bank statements with the same flat attention I used to give a cargo manifest, because that was the only way I knew how to survive reading something that was about to change everything. Ridgeline Holdings LLC had been registered with the state 11 months earlier. Vivian Holt was listed as the sole managing member. 3 transfers from the joint household account, totaling $85,000, had moved into it over the following months. Money that had originally been sitting in a college savings account for Mia and Jack before being consolidated, at Vivian's suggestion, for better interest rates, into an account she then had partial signing authority over. And then I found the date that reorganized everything I thought I understood. Ridgeline Holdings LLC had been registered 11 months earlier. The first transfer into it had happened 10 months earlier. The custody petition citing my therapy records had been filed 3 weeks before tonight. The LLC existed before the custody fight did, not after. Before. This had never been about protecting the children from an unstable mother. It had been, from the very beginning, about moving money somewhere Derek couldn't easily reach it in a divorce, and doing it quietly enough that a custody fight over my mental health would occupy every lawyer's attention while it happened. Derek's confusion on that phone call outside my own kitchen suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. He hadn't fully understood the LLC, because it hadn't been his plan. It had been his mother's, built to survive a divorce he might not have even wanted yet, using a fear about his family's business collapse that Vivian had never fully explained to him.
Because if he'd understood how bad Holt & Sons Construction's debt situation actually was, he might have asked questions she didn't want asked.
I sat very still with that folder open in front of me. Dana watched my face carefully. "You okay?" "I've spent weeks assuming the worst thing in this case was what they were saying about me," I said. "I think I had it backwards."
If you've ever had a moment where the story you'd been told about your own life turned out to be built around a lie somebody else needed to survive, you already know there's a particular kind of stillness that comes after the shock. Not calm exactly, but something adjacent to it. The quiet you find right before you decide what you're going to do with what you now know. I sat with that stillness for exactly as long as I could afford to, and then I closed the folder and started making a list again. Not of feelings, of what came next. I drove home that night and stood in my daughter's doorway for a long time, watching her sleep with one arm thrown over her stuffed rabbit, and I thought about how close $85,000 had come to disappearing from her future because two adults were more afraid of losing face than they were committed to telling the truth. The hearing was in 6 days. For the first time since the porch, since the coffee going cold, since the word instability sitting next to my name like it had earned the right to be there, I understood exactly what I was walking into and exactly what I was going to lay on the table when I got there. The morning of the full hearing, I woke before my alarm, the way I always used to before a movement, that internal clock that never fully turned off, no matter how many years passed since my last uniform. I checked on Jack first, then Mia, both of them still asleep, both of them unaware that today was the day a stranger in a black robe was going to decide how many nights a week they'd sleep under this roof. I sat on the edge of my bed and put on my father's old field watch, the one I'd worn through 3 deployments and every hard day since, its band worn soft and dark from 20 years of use. Derek used to tease me about it early on. "You know you're not in the Army anymore, right? You can wear a normal watch." And I'd always just smiled and kept wearing it, because it wasn't really about the Army. It was about having one thing on my body that reminded me what steady felt like when I needed to remember. I held my wrist up in the bathroom mirror and matched my breathing to the second hand, the way I'd taught junior soldiers to do before a convoy brief. Slow in for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 6. By the time I'd gone through it a dozen times, my hands had stopped feeling like they belonged to someone else. I put on the navy suit Dana had suggested. Not new, not trying to look like anything I wasn't, just clean and pressed and mine. And I drove to the courthouse with the windows down, because I wanted the last few minutes before all of this to smell like early morning instead of recycled air. The courtroom for the full hearing was larger than the one for the emergency motion, with a long table on each side, and Judge Alvarez already reviewing a stack of filings when the bailiff called us to order. Derek sat beside Patrick Ambrose, dressed sharper than I'd seen him in months, his jaw set in the particular way it got when he'd convinced himself he was the one being wronged. Vivian sat directly behind him, cream blazer again, the fabric of her composure pulled tight. Patrick opened confidently, walking the judge through the therapy record excerpts, through a carefully worded narrative about ongoing instability and a pattern of secrecy that he suggested made me an unpredictable presence in the children's lives. He used the word unstable 4 times in 6 minutes. I counted, mostly to keep my hands still.
Dana let him finish completely before she stood.
Your Honor, before we address the substance of these allegations, I'd like the court to note the provenance of these records Mr. Ambrose just quoted. These excerpts were obtained prior to any court-authorized subpoena from a source petitioner's counsel has not disclosed. Patrick started to object. Judge Alvarez held up a hand, not unkindly, but with the specific weight of someone who had already noticed the same thing and was waiting to see if opposing counsel would address it honestly. Counsel, where did these records originate? Patrick hesitated a half-second too long. My client's mother provided background context that informed the filing, Your Honor. Background context, Judge Alvarez repeated, and wrote something down. Dana called Dr. Reyes first. She was precise on the stand, the way she'd been in her office. She confirmed that ongoing engagement with trauma treatment was, per clinical standards, generally a positive indicator of stability rather than a negative one, and she confirmed, without flinching,
that her office had received an improperly scoped request for full session content weeks before any legitimate court order existed.
"Did you comply with that request?" Dana asked.
"No," Dr. Reyes said. "I informed the requesting party that I would only release records under a properly limited court-approved subpoena, which is what I ultimately complied with, and only regarding relevant clinical summary, not raw session transcripts." And yet, petitioner's filing quoted specific session content dated months before that authorized subpoena was ever issued. "I am not able to explain how they obtained that," Dr. Reyes said. "It did not come from my office through any process I authorized." I watched something small shift in Judge Alvarez's expression. Not a verdict, just a flicker of the question she was going to keep asking for the rest of the hearing. Dana called Lieutenant Colonel Sam Whitfield next, my former battalion commander, a broad, quiet man who had driven 4 hours that morning in a suit that fit like it hadn't been out of the closet in a while. Because when Dana had called and explained what this was, he'd said, and I'm quoting him because I asked him to repeat it later, "Tell her I'll be there before she finishes asking." He didn't perform for the room. He answered plainly. He described the convoy incident that had taken Curtis Boyd's life in terms that didn't spare either of us. And he described in the same flat, careful voice what I had done in the 72 hours after. Reorganized 3 supply routes overnight, personally briefed 11 families, never missed a single scheduled duty, never once, in his observation, let grief become a liability to the people depending on her. "I've commanded a lot of officers," he said. "Major Calloway is one of maybe 3 I'd trust with my own children, without a second thought." Patrick tried to press him on cross, suggesting the incident itself proved the existence of ongoing trauma that could resurface unpredictably. LTC Whitfield looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Trauma isn't instability, counselor. Every good officer I've ever served with carries something. The question isn't whether you carry weight. It's whether you drop what you're carrying when it matters. She never has." Dana called me next. I hadn't wanted to testify. Some old instinct that said the fewer words I put into a hostile record, the better. But Dana had been clear that a judge weighing custody wanted to hear the parent's own voice, not just other people's accounts of her. I answered Dana's questions plainly, about my schedule, my treatment history, the routines I kept with Mia and Jack. And I felt steadier doing it than I expected, the way giving a briefing always steadies you once you're actually standing up to give it. Patrick took his turn on cross, and he went where I knew he'd go. "Miss Calloway Holt, isn't it true you never disclosed the full nature of your therapy to your husband during your marriage?" "I disclosed that I attended therapy," I said. "I didn't disclose the content because the content wasn't his to know any more than my husband's private conversations with his own counselor would have been mine." "Wouldn't you agree that kind of secrecy could make a spouse feel shut out?" "I'd agree a marriage needs honesty," I said. "I disagree that honesty means surrendering every private thought a person has ever had. There's a difference between privacy and deception, counselor. I never once lied to my husband. I just didn't hand every hard year of my life to a room that wasn't ready to hold it carefully." He tried once more, reaching for the word instability again, and I answered him the only way that felt true. "I have never missed a school pickup," I said. "I have never once put my children in danger. I have carried grief for a long time, and I have never let it drive." It wasn't a long answer. It wasn't meant to be. Dana had told me once, weeks earlier, that a courtroom remembers short sentences longer than long ones, and I believed her, watching Judge Alvarez write something down and underline it before looking back up. Then Dana moved to the financial record, and I felt the room's attention shift, the way a convoy shifts when the lead vehicle changes speed. She walked the judge through the Meridian Defense Solutions employment verification first, my role as senior advisor, my compensation, confirmed directly by Human Resources under subpoena, careful to note that Meridian had disclosed only what the court required and nothing bound by the company's separate confidentiality obligations. The number on the page made Patrick's easy confidence falter for the first time all morning. Whatever picture he'd built of an unreliable, financially precarious former officer did not survive contact with a verified income figure 4 times what he'd apparently assumed. Then Dana placed the Ridgeline Holdings documents on the table between the 2 sides and asked for the court's permission to walk through the timeline. "Your Honor, this LLC was registered by Vivian Holt 11 months ago.
The first transfer of funds from the Holt joint household account, funds that had originated in a college savings account belonging to the minor children, occurred 10 months ago. The emergency custody petition alleging Miss Calloway Holt's instability was filed 3 weeks ago. She let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to. The mechanism used to challenge my client's fitness as a parent was not a response to a marital breakdown. It predates it. What the record shows is a plan to relocate assets outside the reach of a future divorce, executed under the cover of a custody dispute manufactured to occupy the court's attention and mine.
Patrick objected on relevance. Judge Alvarez overruled him without much hesitation and asked directly whether Vivian Holt was present in the courtroom to speak to the LLC's purpose. She was. She had to be called. And when she stood at the witness table, her composure, the same composure that had watched me across a parking lot 2 weeks earlier and told me this didn't have to happen this way, cracked exactly once, at exactly the moment the judge asked her a simple question.
Ms. Holt, why was this LLC established using funds originally designated as your grandchildren's college savings?
Vivian's mouth opened. For a moment, nothing came out. Beside her, Derek turned his head, slowly, and looked at his mother with an expression I will remember for a long time. Not anger yet, not even hurt, just the particular blankness of a man realizing, in real time, in a public room, that the story he'd been operating on his whole life had a chapter he'd never been shown.
I was protecting this family's future, Vivian finally said. Holt & Sons has debt Derek doesn't fully... The bank was going to... She stopped herself.
Miss Holt, Judge Alvarez said, I'm going to need a direct answer. Did Derek Holt know the extent of his family's financial situation or the existence of this account when the custody petition was filed?
The silence that followed did more work than any testimony could have. Vivian did not answer immediately, and in family court, in front of the person whose trust she'd been counting on longest, that silence answered the question anyway.
No, she said finally, quietly, not entirely. Dana asked one more question before she sat down. Miss Holt, did Derek Holt personally sign each of the 3 transfer authorizations on this account? Vivian's jaw tightened. I had power of attorney for routine household matters, she said. I signed some of those on his behalf. I did not look at her in that moment. I looked at my son and daughter's names on a college savings account statement sitting on the table, and I thought about $85,000 that had almost disappeared into a fight over whether I was fit to raise them. Judge Alvarez took a short recess, and when she returned, she did not deliver a speech. She read a brief, careful finding that the emergency custody petition had relied on improperly obtained and selectively presented clinical information, that no credible evidence supported a finding of parental unfitness, that the timeline of the Ridgeline Holdings transfers raised serious concerns about the petition's underlying motive and about the misuse of marital and children's funds, which the court would refer for further financial review, and that primary custody, effective immediately, would remain with Reese Calloway Holt, with a standard visitation schedule for Derek Holt pending the outcome of the broader divorce and asset proceedings.
She looked up, briefly, at both tables. I want to say one more thing, off the formal record, if counsel will indulge me. A pause. Major Calloway Holt's service record was placed before this court not because it was necessary to prove her fitness. A parent doesn't need a military record to be believed, but because someone in this room tried to use her service against her. And I think it's worth noting, for whatever it's worth to her personally, that the record says exactly the opposite of what was claimed.
It wasn't a salute. Nobody in that room stood up or gasped. It was just a tired, honest woman doing her job well, and it was somehow more than enough. Outside the courthouse, the heat had broken slightly, one of those early evening North Carolina skies going soft gold at the edges. Derek found me near my car before I could leave, Patrick a few steps behind him, uncertain whether to follow.
I didn't know, Derek said. His voice had none of its usual certainty in it. About the account. I swear to you, I didn't know.
I believe you, I said, and I meant it, which surprised us both.
Then why does it feel like I still did this to you?
I thought about that question longer than the moment probably deserved. Because you let her build a case against me without ever once asking me what was true, I said. You didn't need her spreadsheets to know I wasn't unstable, Derek. You were married to me for 12 years. You knew exactly who I was. You just let somebody else's fear be louder than what you actually knew." He didn't have an answer for that. He looked for a second like a much younger man than he was, standing in a courthouse parking lot with his mother's failures suddenly visible on his own face. "I'm not going to make this uglier than it has to be," I told him, and I felt the truth of it as I said it. "Not because I owe you that, because Mia and Jack need at least one parent who isn't fighting a war they'll remember for the rest of their lives. But Derek, I need you to understand that this is the last time I explain myself to anyone in your family. Not to prove I'm stable, not to prove I'm worth trusting. That's done." He nodded, once, and didn't try to walk me to my car. I drove home with the windows down again, and somewhere around the 3rd mile, I finally let myself cry. Not from grief exactly, more like the release of a weight I hadn't fully let myself feel the size of until it was gone. The financial review took 4 months. The $85,000 came back into a protected trust for Mia and Jack, with both of us as co-trustees. Holt & Sons at restructured smaller, and Vivian stopped being asked her opinion. I didn't go after everything the law would have let me take from her. She was still the only grandmother my kids had, and I'd learned the difference between neutralizing a threat and destroying a person. By fall, Derek was in counseling on his own. Our handoffs were careful and a little formal, and a letter from Vivian sat unopened on my counter for 3 weeks before I finally read her confession and said yes, eventually, to supervise time with the kids. On a Sunday evening in late October, I sat on the back steps while Mia and Jack chased fireflies in the last thin light, the kind of evening that made the whole ugly stretch of that year feel briefly, mercifully far away. Jack came running up first, breathless, both hands cupped around something invisible he was sure he'd caught. Mia trailed behind him, slower, and climbed the steps to sit next to me, leaning her head against my shoulder the way she used to when she was smaller. She reached over and picked up my wrist, turning the old field watch over in her fingers, tracing the scratched crystal face with one finger. "Whose was this before you?" she asked. She'd asked before, 100 times probably, in the offhand way kids ask questions they're not sure they'll get a real answer to. I looked at it for a second before I answered. "It was your great-grandfather's, and then it was mine, from the day I first put on a uniform," I said. "I wore it through some of the hardest years of my life. There's a man I served with, his name was Curtis, who I think about every single time I look at it. It reminds me that steady doesn't mean nothing bad ever happens to you. It just means you keep your hands from shaking when it does, so the people counting on you don't have to be scared too." Mia was quiet for a moment, turning that over the way 9-year-olds do, testing whether the sentence fit into a world she was still building the shape of. "Is that why you didn't get scared when Dad's mom said all that stuff about you?" "I got scared," I told her honestly. "I just didn't let the scared part drive." She nodded slowly, like that was an answer she could use, and slid the watch back onto my wrist, careful with the clasp. And I thought, not for the first time, that the real inheritance I wanted to leave my children was never going to be a number in an account, frozen or otherwise. It was this: the difference between fear and instability, the difference between carrying something heavy and being defined by it, the difference between a family that protects its children by telling the truth and a family that protects itself by controlling who gets to hear it.